What if you were being watched by something not of this world? An ominous figure with glowing red eyes, lurking in the shadows. The Mothman isn't just a legend. It's real, and its sightings are linked to death and disaster. Are you ready to uncover the terrifying truth behind this winged creature that has haunted witnesses across the globe? Listen if you dare, but beware, you might not sleep again. Chapter 1. The First Encounter, 1966, in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. It was a cold November night in 1966 when terror first descended on Point Pleasant, West Virginia. For most, it was just another quiet evening in the small town. But for two young couples, that night would forever change the course of their lives and the town's history. Roger Scarberry, his wife Linda, and their friends Steve and Mary Millette were driving along a lonely stretch of road near an old, abandoned TNT plant. The facility had been used during World War II, but had long since fallen into ruin, its hollow buildings and rusted machinery looming over the desolate landscape like relics of a forgotten era. They weren't expecting to find anything out of the ordinary that night, but what they saw would plunge them into a nightmare from which there was no escape. Linda Scarberry was the first to see it. Her voice trembled as she recalled what happened during interviews in the days that followed. In the dim glow of the car's headlights, she spotted something moving, something large, lurking near the shadows of the plant. At first, she thought it was a man, but as the car drew closer, the figure came into clearer view, and a wave of dread washed over her. It wasn't a man at all. Standing at least 7 feet tall, the creature had wings folded against its back and eyes that glowed an unnatural, fiery red. The wings weren't like those of a bird or bat. They seemed almost leathery, grotesque, as if they didn't belong to anything from this world. The couple stared in stunned silence, their breath catching in their throats. Time seemed to stand still, but then the creature moved. It spread its enormous wings and lifted itself into the air with an effortless grace that belied its terrifying size. The couple screamed, fear tightening around their hearts like a vice. Roger slammed his foot on the gas pedal, sending the car racing down the road in a desperate attempt to escape whatever it was that had taken to the sky above them. But the creature wasn't finished with them. It gave chase. No matter how fast they drove, it kept pace with them, swooping low over the car, its glowing red eyes fixed on them like a predator stalking its prey. Linda, pale and trembling, remembered the way its eyes seemed to burn through the darkness, haunting her long after the encounter. The sound of its wings beating against the wind was like nothing she'd ever heard, a deep, otherworldly thrumming that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. The couple sped toward the safety of town, their hearts pounding in their chests, but the creature followed them until they crossed the city limits. Only then, when they were back under the protection of street lights and human civilization, did the creature vanish into the night, leaving nothing but the cold wind and their own terror. Once they reached town, the couples immediately went to the Mason County Courthouse to report what had happened. Their story was met with a mix of disbelief and fear. What they described sounded like something out of a nightmare, but the terror in their eyes was unmistakable. The police, though skeptical, agreed to investigate the area around the TNT plant, but by the time they arrived, the creature was long gone, leaving behind no trace of its existence. But the story didn't end there. Over the following days, more and more sightings of the creature began to surface. Local newspapers quickly picked up the story, and the town of Point Pleasant found itself gripped by a wave of hysteria. The creature, now dubbed Mothman due to its bat-like wings and strange eyes, became the talk of the town. Eyewitnesses came forward with accounts of their own encounters, each more terrifying than the last. Some claimed to have seen Mothman standing near their homes, watching them through their windows with those burning red eyes. Others reported seeing the creature flying low over the trees, its massive wings casting shadows across the ground. No one knew where it had come from or what it wanted, but fear spread like wildfire. Parents kept their children indoors after dark. People began locking their doors, peering out through drawn curtains as if they expected the creature to appear at any moment. The panic grew to such an extent that journalists from across the country descended on Point Pleasant to cover the unfolding events. Police reports and witness statements were documented in meticulous detail, capturing the terror that gripped the town. Even skeptics who dismissed the sightings as mass hysteria couldn't deny the fear that hung heavy in the air. Something was out there, and no one knew what it was. In one particularly chilling report, a local farmer described how his dog had gone missing shortly after he saw the creature near his property. The dog had been barking frantically at something in the woods, but when the farmer went to investigate, the animal had vanished without a trace. No tracks, no signs of struggle, just silence and the oppressive feeling of being watched. As the sightings continued, more bizarre phenomena were reported. People spoke of strange lights in the sky, odd phone calls with distorted voices, and unexplainable mechanical failures in their homes and vehicles. It seemed as if the Mothman's presence was somehow tied to other, darker forces. Fear turned to paranoia, and Point Pleasant became a town on edge. Though many tried to rationalize the sightings, dismissing them as misidentified animals or hallucinations born of fear, those who had seen Mothman knew the truth. There was something unnatural about the creature, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. And as the reports mounted, one thing became clear. Mothman wasn't just a figment of imagination. It was real, and it was watching. For the people of Point Pleasant, that November night in 1966 was just the beginning. As the months passed, the sightings continued, leading to an event far more devastating than anyone could have imagined. But in that moment, as the two young couples sped away from the TNT plant, their hearts racing and their minds struggling to comprehend what they had seen, they couldn't know the terror that lay ahead. All they knew was that they had come face to face with something beyond human understanding, and that the Mothman was only just beginning its reign of fear. Chapter 2. The Mothman Phenomenon, Waves of Fear. The initial Mothman encounter had set the stage for a nightmare that would grip Point Pleasant for over a year. After the Scarberry and Millette couple's terrifying run-in with the creature in November of 1966, it was as if a floodgate of fear had been opened. The creature, this winged, red-eyed terror, began appearing again and again, hovering at the edges of people's lives like a shadow too dark to ignore. In the months that followed, Point Pleasant became a breeding ground for terror. Eyewitness reports came pouring in, each story more unnerving than the last. Men, women, and even children described the same creature, a towering figure, somewhere between a man and a bird, with enormous wings and eyes that burned like coals in the night. The Mothman, as the locals now called it, didn't need to attack to create terror. Its presence alone seemed to paralyze those who saw it, leaving them cold with a sense of impending doom. Take the account of Marcella Bennett, who had an unforgettable encounter just days after the first sighting. She was visiting the home of a friend near the TNT area when she spotted something lurking in the darkness. It was massive, standing upright like a man, but with wings folded against its back. As it moved, its eyes locked onto her, glowing an eerie red. Overcome with a fear so profound it made her legs buckle, she dropped to the ground, clutching her child in a desperate attempt to protect them both. When she finally scrambled to her feet, the creature had disappeared into the night, leaving her shaking uncontrollably. For weeks, Bennett suffered from nightmares, convinced that Mothman was watching her, waiting for the right moment to return. Bennett's encounter wasn't isolated. Across Point Pleasant, people began reporting similar sightings, their terror etched into police records and local news reports. The sightings clustered around the TNT plant, but they extended out into the surrounding areas, as though the creature was stretching its wings over the entire town. It was in the skies above farms, on the outskirts of neighborhoods, and occasionally even on quiet back roads, where it would swoop down over passing cars, sending drivers into panicked frenzies. One of the most unsettling accounts came from Newell Partridge, a local resident living on the outskirts of town. Late one evening, Partridge was watching television when the screen suddenly flickered and went black. A strange, high-pitched whine filled the room, sending a chill down his spine. Partridge grabbed his flashlight and headed outside to check his antenna, but as soon as he stepped into his yard, his dog, Bandit, began growling and barking at something in the distance. Partridge aimed his flashlight into the nearby field, And there, standing by a fence, were two glowing red eyes staring directly at him. They weren't like any animal's eyes he had ever seen. They were bigger, brighter, more sinister. His dog bolted toward the creature, barking ferociously, and Partridge called after him. But Bandit disappeared into the darkness, never to return. That night, Partridge claimed he heard a flapping sound, like enormous wings, coming from above his house. The next day, he found no sign of Bandit, only strange footprints in the mud where his dog had last stood. He later discovered that other people in the area had seen the Mothman that same night, and he became convinced that the creature had taken his dog. Partridge's experience, along with others, contributed to a growing sense of paranoia and fear in Point Pleasant. It wasn't just the sightings that were unsettling. It was the atmosphere of dread that seemed to follow Mothman. People who encountered the creature often described an overwhelming sense of doom, a feeling that something catastrophic was just around the corner. They weren't imagining it either. The local police were inundated with calls from frantic residents, many of them convinced that they were being stalked by the Mothman. Journalists and investigators arrived in town, interviewing witnesses and combing through police reports, trying to make sense of the panic that was gripping the community. Local newspapers ran headlines almost daily, chronicling the strange sightings and eerie happenings that seemed to plague the area. The Point Pleasant Register ran a piece titled "Winged, Red-Eyed Thing Chases Point Pleasant Couples Across Countryside," describing the terror felt by the Scarberrys and the Millettes and setting off a media frenzy. But the more coverage the story got, the more people came forward with their own stories, and soon it became impossible to dismiss the phenomenon as mere hysteria. One of the most harrowing reports came from Connie Carpenter, a young woman who encountered the Mothman while driving home from church. She claimed to have seen the creature standing by the roadside, its wings outstretched, its eyes burning into hers. As she drove past, the Mothman took flight, soaring after her car at an incredible speed. She screamed as she floored the gas pedal, but it kept up with her, flying just above her windshield before veering off into the trees. Carpenter later suffered from conjunctivitis, a condition caused by extreme eye irritation, which she attributed to having looked into the creature's glowing red eyes. As the months passed, the frequency of the sightings only increased, and with them came an intensifying sense of dread. Many in the town believed the creature was an omen of something terrible to come. Others were convinced it was a harbinger of death, a supernatural being whose presence foretold disaster. Police reports from that time document a community on edge, with citizens fearing for their safety and the safety of their families. No one felt safe, especially at night. What started as a strange encounter with a flying figure had now blossomed into full-scale hysteria. Eyewitness accounts piled up, chronicled in notebooks, police files, and newspaper articles. The Mothman was no longer just a legend. It had become a real and terrifying presence in Point Pleasant. And as the sightings continued into 1967, the town braced itself for something darker, something no one could have anticipated. The Mothman, it seemed, was not just a creature of flesh and bone, but a sign of doom, hovering like a dark cloud over Point Pleasant. The terror was growing, and it felt as though disaster was imminent. Chapter 3: The Omen of Disaster, the Silver Bridge Collapse. On a bitterly cold evening in December 1967, the Silver Bridge, which connected Point Pleasant, West Virginia to Gallipolis, Ohio, stood shrouded in the twilight of the waning day. The narrow, aging suspension bridge, built in 1928, creaked under the weight of rush-hour traffic. Commuters were heading home, shopping for Christmas gifts, or traveling to visit loved ones as the holiday season approached. None of them could have known the horror that awaited them, nor the dark force many believed had been haunting their small town for over a year. For months, Point Pleasant had been gripped by fear. The mysterious sightings of the Mothman, a towering, winged creature with glowing red eyes, had rattled the community to its core. Residents whispered about the strange being, calling it an omen of disaster. The creature had appeared to dozens of people, hovering silently over the town, watching with an eerie, otherworldly gaze. Some claimed it stalked them, others said it haunted their dreams. But nothing could prepare them for what was coming on that fateful December day. The collapse of the Silver Bridge was a disaster unlike anything Point Pleasant had ever experienced. At 5:05 p.m., as the last rays of sunlight faded, the bridge suddenly gave way. Metal twisted and groaned as the structure collapsed into the icy waters of the Ohio River below. Dozens of cars plummeted into the river, disappearing into the cold, unforgiving depths. Screams filled the air, mixing with the cacophony of metal grinding and snapping as the bridge disintegrated. Within moments, 46 people were dead, and the peaceful town of Point Pleasant was plunged into unimaginable grief. In the days that followed, rescue efforts were grim. Divers scoured the murky water for bodies, and the wreckage of the bridge was pulled from the river, piece by piece. The media descended upon the small town, turning the tragedy into national news. But amid the chaos, whispers of the Mothman grew louder. Many believed that the creature's appearance had been a warning, an omen of the catastrophe that had now come to pass. Eyewitnesses began to speak out, claiming they had seen the Mothman in the days leading up to the bridge's collapse. One resident, a local mechanic named Richard West, reported seeing the creature perched on the cables of the bridge just days before it fell. According to West, he was driving home one night when his headlights illuminated a massive figure standing on the side of the road, just before the bridge. Its wings were folded behind it, and its glowing red eyes followed him as he passed. West didn't stop, his heart pounding in his chest, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The creature's presence seemed like a bad omen, and in retrospect, he believed the Mothman had been warning him of the tragedy to come. Other residents also reported seeing the creature near the bridge. Mary Heyer, a local journalist who had been covering the Mothman sightings extensively, claimed that several witnesses came to her office in the days before the collapse, describing sightings of the winged figure. One man, a truck driver named John Frick, claimed he had seen the Mothman flying over the bridge at dusk on the evening of December 13th, just 2 days before the disaster. Frick had stopped his truck in shock as the creature swooped low over the structure, its massive wings casting long shadows in the fading light. He couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was watching, waiting for something dreadful to happen. But perhaps the most unsettling account came from Linda Scarberry, one of the original witnesses of the Mothman in 1966. In the days before the Silver Bridge collapsed, Scarberry claimed to have experienced a series of vivid nightmares. In her dreams, she saw the bridge collapsing, cars falling into the river, and the sound of metal tearing apart. When she woke, she was overcome with an overwhelming sense of dread. Scarberry had long been plagued by sightings of the Mothman since her first encounter, but these dreams felt different. They felt like a warning. She didn't know how to explain it, but she believed the Mothman was trying to communicate with her, to tell her that something terrible was going to happen. When the bridge collapsed, Scarberry was horrified but not surprised. The connection between the Mothman and the Silver Bridge collapse was undeniable for many in Point Pleasant. Local police, investigating the disaster, were aware of the numerous reports of Mothman sightings, but they had no concrete evidence to link the creature to the tragedy. The official cause of the collapse was later determined to be the failure of a single eyebar, a critical component of the bridge's structure, that had fractured due to stress corrosion. But for those who had witnessed the Mothman, the collapse of the bridge seemed too coincidental to be explained by engineering failure alone. In the weeks following the disaster, the sightings of the Mothman all but ceased. The creature that had terrorized Point Pleasant for over a year vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. Some believed that the Mothman's purpose had been fulfilled, that it had come to warn the town of the impending disaster, and then disappeared once its warning was no longer needed. Others believed that the creature was somehow responsible for the tragedy, an agent of chaos sent to bring death and destruction to their small town. To this day, the residents of Point Pleasant remain haunted by the events of 1966 and 1967. The Mothman legend lives on, passed down from generation to generation, a chilling reminder of the strange and unexplainable events that once gripped their town. The Silver Bridge, which once stood as a symbol of progress and connection, now serves as a tragic monument to the lives lost in the disaster. And the Mothman, whether an omen of doom, a harbinger of disaster, or a figment of mass hysteria, continues to cast a long, dark shadow over the town's history. For those who believe in the power of omens, the Mothman's presence was no accident. It came with a message, a warning written in the skies above Point Pleasant, one that went unheeded until it was too late. Chapter 4. Investigators and Theories, The Search for the Truth. By late 1966, the town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, was no longer just another quiet American town. The sightings of the Mothman, an eerie, winged creature with glowing red eyes, had become a terrifying fixture in the minds of the residents. Word of these strange encounters spread quickly, drawing the attention of investigators, journalists, and paranormal enthusiasts from across the country. Among them was the famed author and journalist John Keel, whose research into UFOs and the paranormal would soon lead him down a path of strange and unsettling events. When Keel arrived in Point Pleasant, he was greeted by an atmosphere thick with fear. Locals recounted their sightings of the Mothman with trembling voices, some refusing to speak of the creature at all. Something dark had settled over the town, and the Mothman was just the beginning. Strange lights appeared in the sky, electrical appliances malfunctioned without explanation, and mysterious men in black began visiting residents, warning them to stay quiet about what they had seen. Keel immediately set to work, interviewing witnesses and cataloging their experiences. The stories were consistent. Everyone described the creature in the same way. A massive figure with wings, standing 6 to 7 feet tall, its eyes glowing red like burning coals. The Mothman seemed to stalk its victims, appearing suddenly and vanishing just as quickly, leaving behind an overwhelming sense of dread. One witness described feeling as though the creature could read his mind, that its gaze penetrated deeper than just sight. But the Mothman was not the only unexplained phenomenon plaguing Point Pleasant. Keel quickly discovered that many witnesses reported seeing strange lights in the sky around the same time as the Mothman sightings. Glowing orbs and unidentified flying objects were said to hover silently over the town, disappearing into the night without a trace. The connection between these sightings and the Mothman was unclear, but Keel began to suspect that whatever was happening in Point Pleasant was part of something much larger, a convergence of strange, supernatural forces. Keel's investigation took a darker turn when he started receiving bizarre phone calls. Late at night, his phone would ring, and on the other end, there would be nothing but a strange mechanical hum. Sometimes a voice, monotone and emotionless, would deliver cryptic messages. The words were jumbled, fragmented, and often impossible to understand, but Keel sensed they were warnings. He wasn't the only one receiving these calls. Several witnesses who had reported seeing the Mothman or UFOs also began receiving unsettling phone calls, often in the middle of the night. As Keel delved deeper into the mysteries of Point Pleasant, residents began to share stories about strange men who had appeared in town, men who didn't seem quite human. These so-called men in black would visit witnesses, asking about their experiences with the Mothman and UFOs. They dressed in black suits, their skin pale and waxy, and they spoke in odd, clipped tones. Witnesses described them as unsettling, their mannerisms stiff and unnatural. One woman reported that a man in black visited her home after she had seen the Mothman, warning her not to speak to anyone about what she had witnessed. When she asked who he was, he simply smiled, a wide, unnatural grin, and left without another word. She was left shaking with fear, certain that these men were not of this world. Keel's research began to uncover other strange patterns. He discovered that UFO sightings had increased across the country during the same period as the Mothman sightings. Some speculated that the Mothman was not a creature of flesh and blood, but a being from another dimension, or even an extraterrestrial entity. Keel himself began to suspect that the Mothman might be connected to UFOs, perhaps serving as a warning of impending danger or catastrophe. But danger from whom? The answers remained elusive. One of the most unsettling aspects of Keel's investigation came from his own personal experiences. As he spent more time in Point Pleasant, he began to feel as though he was being watched, followed by unseen forces. His car would break down for no apparent reason. His hotel room phone would ring in the middle of the night with no one on the other end. And on more than one occasion, he found himself being followed by strange men in dark cars. It felt as though someone, or something, was trying to keep him from uncovering the truth. Keel wasn't alone in these experiences. Many locals warned him to be cautious, claiming that anyone who got too close to the truth would face dire consequences. One elderly resident told Keel that he believed the Mothman was an omen of doom, sent to warn the town of an impending disaster. He advised Keel to leave before it was too late, muttering under his breath about forces that shouldn't be tampered with. Despite these warnings, Keel pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. He compiled a growing list of evidence, eyewitness testimonies, police reports, and accounts of strange lights in the sky. The deeper he dug, the more he became convinced that the Mothman sightings were connected to something far beyond the realm of ordinary understanding. Whether it was a government conspiracy, an alien presence, or something even more sinister, Keel was determined to find out. But as the months went on, the fear in Point Pleasant grew. More and more people claimed to see the Mothman, and the town seemed to be on the brink of hysteria. Electrical disturbances became more frequent, with entire sections of the town experiencing blackouts. People spoke of eerie sounds in the night, like distant screams or metallic clanging. Something was coming. Keel could feel it in the air, a palpable tension that gripped the town like a vice. In December of 1967, Keel's worst fears were realized when the Silver Bridge collapsed, killing 46 people. The disaster seemed to confirm what many in Point Pleasant had feared. The Mothman was an omen of doom, and his appearance had been a warning of the catastrophe to come. In the aftermath of the tragedy, the Mothman sightings stopped as suddenly as they had begun, leaving behind a town forever scarred by the events of the previous year. Keel's investigation into the Mothman phenomenon left him with more questions than answers. The strange sightings, phone calls, and men in black visits pointed to something far larger than a mere local legend, something that transcended the boundaries of the natural world. To this day, the truth about the Mothman remains shrouded in mystery, leaving behind only the chilling accounts of those who experienced its terror firsthand. Chapter 5: Global Sightings, the Mothman's Shadow Across the World. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, will always be synonymous with the legend of the Mothman. But what many don't know is that similar creatures, terrifying, winged humanoids with glowing eyes, have been seen far beyond the quiet streets of this small American town. Across the globe, from the decaying ruins of Chernobyl to the darkened skies of Mexico, eerie accounts of monstrous figures have emerged, each more unsettling than the last. With every sighting comes the same horrifying conclusion: disaster is not far behind. In the sweltering summer of 1986, high above the desolate forest surrounding the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine, a nightmare took shape. Workers at the plant began reporting strange sightings of a large, winged creature with glowing red eyes. Some said it hovered near the reactor, its form barely discernible in the hazy sky. Others claimed it perched on the plant's towering structures, watching them with an unnatural, oppressive gaze. The rumors spread quickly through the plant, fueling an already tense atmosphere as the workers whispered about the mysterious figure, afraid to mention it too loudly, as if doing so might bring them closer to the horror they feared. As the weeks wore on, the sightings became more frequent. The creature seemed to appear just before something went wrong: a malfunction, an unexpected system failure, or a near disaster. The plant's workers grew increasingly paranoid, convinced that the creature's appearance was a dire omen. Then, on April 26, 1986, disaster struck. Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded, unleashing a catastrophic amount of radioactive material into the air. The worst nuclear disaster in history had begun, and many believed the creature, dubbed the Blackbird of Chernobyl, had been a harbinger of the devastation. Those who survived the initial disaster spoke of the creature in hushed tones. Its presence burned into their memories. It had been there, they said, right before the explosion. And after the disaster, it was never seen again. The eerie connection between the sightings and the catastrophic event fueled a belief that the Mothman, or something like it, was not confined to Point Pleasant. It could appear anywhere, bringing with it a warning of doom. Thousands of miles away, in Mexico, a similarly unsettling figure was spotted in 2009 in the city of Monterey. As residents of the area prepared for Hurricane Alex, a monstrous storm that would leave a trail of destruction, several locals reported seeing a strange figure in the skies. It was described as a tall, humanoid creature with enormous wings and glowing red eyes that cut through the storm clouds like embers in the dark. Some said the creature swooped low over the streets, disappearing into the dense fog, while others claimed it watched silently from rooftops as if it was waiting for something. Just days later, the hurricane made landfall, devastating the city with floods and destruction. Local newspapers picked up on the stories, but most people dismissed the sightings as hysteria brought on by fear of the incoming storm. Yet, for those who witnessed the figure, it was no coincidence that the creature appeared on the eve of a catastrophe. The locals called it El Hombre Perro, the Birdman, and whispered that it was a bad omen. After the storm passed, the sightings stopped, but the legend of the Birdman lingered like the oppressive humidity that followed in the wake of the storm. Further north, in the industrial sprawl of Chicago, something even more sinister began to take shape. Over a series of weeks in 2017, dozens of people reported seeing a winged creature in the skies above the city. Descriptions of the entity were chillingly familiar: a dark, humanoid figure with massive wings and red, glowing eyes. It was said to glide silently through the air, seen by multiple witnesses in different parts of the city. Some reported it as a shadow that swooped low over Lake Michigan, while others claimed to have seen it watching them from the tops of skyscrapers, unmoving and silent. The reports sparked a wave of fear across Chicago, especially when witnesses began to experience feelings of intense dread and panic after encountering the creature. Some people believed the sightings were a prelude to a massive disaster, much like the Mothman sightings before the Silver Bridge collapse. Others speculated that the creature was a supernatural entity sent to warn of impending doom. Yet, no catastrophe immediately followed the sightings in Chicago, leaving some to wonder whether the creature had come to deliver a different kind of warning, perhaps of something more gradual, a disaster unfolding in slow motion. Some even suggested that the creature's appearance might be tied to the increasing violence and chaos in the city, as if it were a harbinger of societal collapse rather than a single destructive event. Despite the lack of an immediate disaster, the Chicago sightings bore a striking resemblance to the Mothman legend, and for those who had seen the creature, there was no doubt that something dark had come to their city. They believed the creature's appearance was more than just a myth. It was an omen that could not be ignored. Across the world, from the dense forests of West Virginia to the bleak, irradiated wasteland of Chernobyl, and the storm-lashed streets of Mexico to the bustling metropolis of Chicago, the Mothman, or something very much like it, has cast its long shadow. These sightings, eerily similar in nature, have left witnesses with the unmistakable feeling that disaster is always just around the corner when the creature appears. What is it about this winged figure that stirs such fear? Why does it seem to precede tragedy, watching with its glowing red eyes as catastrophe unfolds? The answers remain elusive, and the legend of the Mothman only grows with each new sighting, each new disaster. Whether it is a creature of flesh and blood or something far more sinister, its appearance is always a harbinger of destruction. Perhaps it is not the creature itself that we should fear, but what it represents, a reminder that disaster, in all its forms, is never far from our lives. And as long as the Mothman continues to be seen across the world, there will always be those who believe that where it appears, doom follows in its wake. Chapter 6. The Aftermath. Point Pleasant haunted by the Mothman. The collapse of the Silver Bridge on that cold December evening in 1967 should have marked the end of the Mothman. The creature that had terrorized Point Pleasant for over a year seemed to vanish in the wake of the tragedy, as if its dark purpose had been fulfilled. Yet, as the dust settled and the dead were mourned, a sinister presence lingered. The shadow of the Mothman still loomed over the small West Virginia town, not in the skies, but in the hearts and minds of those who had lived through the nightmare. The bridge was gone, But the terror was far from over. The days and weeks after the disaster were consumed with grief. 46 lives had been lost, and the weight of that tragedy bore down on the town like a suffocating fog. But there was something else, something unspoken that hung in the air of fear. Some residents believed the Mothman had been a warning, a harbinger of the disaster, while others whispered darker theories. Perhaps the creature had caused the collapse, fulfilling a malevolent purpose unknown to human minds. Though no one could agree on what exactly had happened, they all felt it. The Mothman was still with them. Decades later, the town of Point Pleasant had changed. New buildings rose where old ones crumbled, and the scars of the Silver Bridge collapse faded with time. But the stories never stopped. Even after the sightings of the winged creature became fewer and farther between, strange occurrences continued to plague the town. People whispered of things that defied explanation. Lights in the sky, disembodied voices, and shadowy figures lurking at the edge of their vision. Eyewitnesses, many reluctant to speak at first, came forward with unsettling accounts of their encounters, accounts that seemed to suggest the Mothman was not truly gone. One of the earliest post-bridge sightings came from a local man named Jake Reynolds. In 1973, as he walked home late one evening, he saw a figure standing in the woods just off the road. At first, he thought it was a person, but something about its posture, its size, was off. It was hunched over, its eyes glowing red in the darkness. Paralyzed by fear, Jake could do nothing but stare as the creature unfolded massive wings, stretching impossibly wide, and rose silently into the air. He never spoke of what he saw until years later, when the growing number of strange happenings in town gave him the courage to finally tell his story. It wasn't gone, he told the local paper. The Mothman. It was just waiting. Jake's account was just one of many. Over the years, reports trickled in from all corners of Point Pleasant. A woman driving down a deserted road late at night swore she saw something flying low above the treetops, keeping pace with her car before vanishing into the darkness. Another man, an old farmer living on the outskirts of town, claimed that he had heard footsteps outside his home at night, slow and deliberate, accompanied by a low, metallic hum. When he investigated, there was nothing there, but he always felt like something was watching him, just out of sight. Then there were the more disturbing reports. In the 1980s, several residents of Point Pleasant spoke of waking in the middle of the night to find their homes filled with a strange, oppressive atmosphere. Lights would flicker, and a heavy, suffocating feeling would press down on them, as if an unseen force was weighing on their chests. Some described hearing faint, high-pitched voices that seemed to whisper from the walls, speaking in a language they couldn't understand. In many of these cases, the witnesses reported seeing red eyes, always in the dark corners of the room, watching them with an unblinking gaze. Journalists, intrigued by the ongoing reports, dug through archives and old police files. They found that even before the Silver Bridge collapse, Point Pleasant had been a hotspot for strange occurrences. The media attention only seemed to fuel the legend, but it wasn't just the townspeople who believed something sinister was still at work. Paranormal investigators descended on the area, seeking to uncover the truth behind the Mothman sightings. They spoke with witnesses, visited old sites like the abandoned TNT plant where the first sighting occurred, and even claimed to experience paranormal phenomena themselves. One such investigator, a man named Bill Edmonds, recounted an eerie encounter during his visit in 1992. He had been exploring the area near the old munitions plant at night when he suddenly felt a sharp drop in temperature. The air around him grew thick, and he was overcome with the overwhelming sensation that he was being watched. When he turned around, he saw them, two glowing red eyes, staring at him from within the trees. He ran, but the feeling of dread followed him all the way back to his car. It wasn't just a legend, he said later in an interview. The Mothman is still here. As the years went by, the legend of the Mothman became inseparable from Point Pleasant's identity. The town had transformed from a quiet, unknown place to a hub for paranormal enthusiasts, tourists, and researchers alike. Festivals celebrating the creature were held. Museums dedicated to the legend opened. And yet, beneath it all, the terror remained. For the locals, it wasn't just about the spectacle or the fame. It was about survival. The Mothman was more than a symbol or a story. It was real, and for those who had seen it, there was no escaping its presence. In the end, the people of Point Pleasant are left to grapple with the question that has haunted them for decades. Was the Mothman a warning, a messenger of doom, or something far more malevolent? As strange sightings and eerie occurrences continue, one thing is certain: the Mothman's legacy is far from over. Point Pleasant, haunted by both memory and myth, remains trapped under the creature's dark shadow, where fear and fascination are one and the same. Chapter 7. The Mothman Legacy, Fear, Mystery, and Cultural Impact. Even though decades have passed since the Silver Bridge disaster and the wave of Mothman sightings in Point Pleasant, the legend refuses to die. The winged creature with glowing red eyes, once relegated to whispered warnings and local folklore, has spread its influence far beyond the quiet West Virginia town where it was first seen. The fear that the Mothman inspires is not just a remnant of the past. It has taken root in modern culture, continuing to terrify, mystify, and captivate new generations. As you listen to these chilling accounts, remember, these stories are not confined to history. The legacy of the Mothman remains an ever-present shadow, lurking on the edges of our understanding, waiting for the next person to glimpse those haunting red eyes. In Point Pleasant, the memories of the creature still run deep. For some residents, the Mothman is more than a legend. It's an undeniable reality that shaped their town forever. Documented interviews with locals paint a picture of a community haunted by the events of the 1960s, a place where the supernatural seems to bleed into everyday life. Residents like Mary Millette, who witnessed the Mothman herself in 1966, still speak of the creature with fear in their voices. In an interview from the late 1990s, Mary recalled how she and her family lived in terror after their encounter. It was like a curse, she said. No matter where you went, you felt it watching. Other locals have reported strange occurrences that continue to this day. Cars that suddenly malfunction near the TNT area where the creature was first spotted. Unexplained lights that dance across the sky over the Ohio River. And always the chilling sense that something just out of sight is observing them. Many of these stories never make it to the media, whispered instead among friends and families who have learned that talking too much about the Mothman can attract its attention. Point Pleasant has embraced the creature in some ways, immortalizing it in festivals, statues, and museums. But behind the celebratory facade lies a lingering unease. The Mothman Festival, held annually since 2002, attracts thousands of tourists and enthusiasts. But even in the midst of the spectacle, locals know the truth, that the legend is not just entertainment. They know it represents a darker, more sinister reality. Journalists and historians continue to dig into the Mothman phenomenon, trying to untangle the web of sightings, disasters, and bizarre experiences tied to the creature. One such historian, Jeff Walmsley, who runs the Mothman Museum in Point Pleasant, has spent years collecting witness accounts and preserving the stories that refuse to fade. People think it's just a legend, but I've spoken to too many people who've seen something they can't explain, Walmsley remarked in an interview. His collection includes everything from news articles to police reports to handwritten letters from frightened witnesses. And despite the museum's focus on the past, new reports trickle in every year, as if the Mothman's influence has never truly left. The reach of the Mothman has extended far beyond West Virginia. Sightings of similar creatures have cropped up all over the world, fueling speculation that the Mothman is not a local phenomenon, but something larger, something universal. From Chernobyl to Mexico to modern-day Chicago, witnesses have reported encounters with a large, winged figure, often in the days leading up to disasters. In Ukraine, shortly before the catastrophic Chernobyl nuclear meltdown, locals claim to have seen a creature resembling the Mothman flying over the doomed reactor. Survivors of the disaster later described a black-winged beast with glowing red eyes that seemed to be warning of the impending doom. Similar stories have emerged from Mexico, where residents of certain towns insist that they have seen the creature before earthquakes and other natural disasters. One particularly chilling account comes from 2017, when Chicago experienced a string of eerie sightings of what was described as a large, bat-like figure flying above the city. Multiple witnesses reported feelings of intense dread and panic, and while no single disaster followed these sightings, the sheer number of reports has led many to wonder if the Mothman had migrated to the urban jungle. In popular culture, the Mothman has become an icon of fear and mystery. Films, books, and documentaries have all tried to capture the terror that the creature represents. The 2002 film The Mothman Prophecies, based on journalist John Keel's investigations, brought the legend into the mainstream, blending real-life events with unsettling supernatural undertones. Keel's own experiences with the Mothman were strange enough, including bizarre phone calls and interactions with the infamous Men in Black that many conspiracy theorists believe are connected to UFO sightings and paranormal events. Despite the fame of these accounts, the most unsettling aspect of the Mothman remains its elusiveness. Unlike other cryptids or supernatural beings, the Mothman's presence isn't confined to one type of folklore or one region. It appears as an omen, a harbinger of doom, but always just outside the realm of explanation. This has led to countless theories, from the creature being an interdimensional traveler to a manifestation of collective anxiety. Some even believe the Mothman is a government experiment gone wrong, its appearances tied to covert military activities and cover-ups. Yet, the true horror of the Mothman lies not in the theories, but in the fear it instills. Witnesses consistently report overwhelming dread, a sensation that something unnatural is close by, watching. The creature's glowing red eyes seem to pierce through the veil between the ordinary and the terrifying unknown. To see the Mothman, many believe, is to glimpse into a world we were never meant to understand, a place where reality twists and nightmares come alive. The legend of the Mothman endures not just because of the stories of those who saw it, but because of what it represents, a lurking terror, always waiting in the wings, just out of sight, ready to return at any moment. As new sightings and stories continue to emerge, one thing is certain. The Mothman's shadow has not left us. It haunts not just Point Pleasant, but the corners of our collective fears. In the end, the Mothman is more than just a cryptid or an omen. It is a reminder of the unknown, a reminder that there are things in this world we cannot understand, and they are watching. As the Mothman legend continues to haunt the shadows of our world, its mystery grows with each passing day. Now, it's your turn. Have you ever witnessed something unexplainable, felt the chill of unseen eyes watching, or encountered the Mothman itself? Share your own eerie experiences and thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your story before it's too late.